Hello, Jason Moore here again from Guitar Solo Dojo. I'm going to spring off of this last subject we talked about, and that's just soloing in layers over a basic chord progression. We're going to take it just a step further though, and we're going to assume, we'll go back to the key of B, where this is our 1 chord, just an E shape at the 7th fret, and our 4 chord would be an A shape at the 7th fret as well. And I'm going and adding in that 5th in the bass, which is the 7th fret on the low E string, for the 4 chord, so however you want to play it. But I'm going to use that because that's going to be part of our exercise. Now, if you don't already know it, this is something you should work on, just memorizing what each note, how each note functions in the chord and all these chord shapes that you're playing. So in this chord, we just have 2 chords in this sequence here. So the 1 chord is an E shape, and so no matter where you move the E shape, it's always going to be root, 5th, root, 3rd, 5th, root, always. And if I do this A shape, and I add in that low E string, it's 5th, root, 5th, root, 3rd, 5th. Okay, so those are my basics. But now I'm going to extend this out and assume that the rhythm track is using dominant 7ths, which is a very common thing to do. Now I need to understand the relationship between the 7th and other things a little bit better. And we're going to go ahead and flesh this whole chord out, okay, the whole dominant 7th chord. So a dominant 7th chord, in case you don't know, is based off of essentially a major triad. And if you take that major triad and you add in an extra note 1.5 steps above the 5th, which would be our 7th, we get a dominant 7th. Okay, so when you go 1.5 steps above the 5th, that creates a 7th that's a whole step below the root, which is the essence of the dominant 7th chord. Major chord with the interval of a minor 7th stacked on top of it. Okay, so how the rest of it relates together when we look at the root to the 3rd. Root to 3rd is 2 whole steps, 3rd to 5th is 1.5 steps, the 5th to the 7th is 1.5, and then the 7th back to the root is a whole step. Very important to remember that. Write that down if you don't have it already. Root to 3rd, 2, 3rd to 5th, 1.5, 5th to 7th, 1.5, and 7th back to the root is 1. Okay, very, very important. So, and this is the beginning of your visualization of how you're going to put all this stuff together. Okay, so I'm going to look at this chord, and I'm going to take it 1 string at a time, and I'm going to say, okay, well, this string has a root on it. And as we just talked about, I know that if I want to go down to the 7th, I go down a whole step. Okay, so here we go. Down to my 7th, and go back up to my root. If I want to stay on this same string and go to the 3rd, I know I have to go up 2 whole steps, which would be right there. So I can go root, down to 7th, back up to the root, then up to the 3rd. Okay. When I go to the next string, the A string, I'm starting with this note in the chord shape, and that's the 5th of the chord. So I have my 5th, and I can drop down 1.5 steps to the 3rd, and I go back up to the 5th, then 1.5 steps up to the 7th. Then I go to the next string, which is a root. Drop down a whole step to the 7th, back to the root, up 2 whole steps to the 3rd. When I get to the next string, I have my 3rd again. So I'm going to drop down 2 whole steps to the root, back to the 3rd, up 1.5 steps to the 5th. And I'm going to keep doing this. So on the B string, I'm on the 5th, drop down to the 3rd, 1.5, back to the 5th, up to the 7th, 1.5 up. Then I've got the high E string, which looks just like the low E, so root, 7th, root, 3rd. That's our basic idea. So here's what it looks like. And when I practice this as an exercise, it's not like you're ever going to do this in a song, most likely, but when I practice it as an exercise, I try to stay extremely structured with it, so I'm always practicing the same thing. Otherwise, it's not really practice if you kind of practice it a little bit different each time. So here's what I look at. I always start with my first finger on the actual chord tone, in this case the root. I'm going to slide down to the lower note, which is the 7th here, slide back up, then I'm going to hammer on to the higher note with the pinky. And so we're only using the note of the chord shape and its adjacent chord tones on that string. So root, 7th, root, 3rd. So that's what it looks like. I go to the next string, I start from the 5th. And the same concept, only this time it's going to be 5th, slide down to the 3rd, back up to the 5th, hammer on to the 7th. Then I go to the next string. And that's what the basic exercise looks like. Then we go to the 4 chord. Keeping in mind that even though typically your A shape starts on the A string, I'm going to add in the 5th down here. So I'm going to go 5th, down to the 3rd, back up to the 5th, up to the 7th. Then I finally get to the A string, which is the root, root, 7th, root, 3rd. And I just follow the same exact idea. Now, that's step 1. Okay, so we'll take step 1 and If you don't remember the starter lick idea, we're just going to take a real basic starter lick. Right there. Okay, now when I'm looking at this one chord, I'm not just seeing the notes in this immediate chord shape, I'm seeing those notes and all of the adjacent chord tones as well. Meaning on every string, I'm going to have 3 different options, at least. This is just the start. At 3 different options, at least from now, that I can resolve to. So if I take my starter lick again, well, I have a third right here, but I could walk that third up to the 5th if I want to. Or I could do my starter lick, then drop down to the 7th, maybe drop down to that third. So now I've got a different kind of place to resolve to. Or I could take the same starter lick, which this note right here, the 7th of the chord, is also in the pentatonic scale, but when you're really targeting it, it just feels different when you know that it's a 7th and you're landing on it with a purpose. Now I've got a really cool thing. I could bend to it, because bends count just the same as any other note as long as you land on the right pitch. So now, on to the next exercise. We're going to practice going between the 1 chord and the 4 chord by staying on 1 string and utilizing all these chord tones and their adjacent chord tones. So, back to the 1 chord. I'm going to do my root, 7th, root, 3rd, and then I'm going to play over the chord change, which I'm going to the 4 chord. I'm going to stay on that string, and this time it's a 5th, so 5th, down to the 3rd, up to the 7th. So I'm spelling out the chord progression, just staying on 1 string. So here's the 1 chord, onto the 4 chord. And I go to the next string, keeping in mind that now it's the 5th, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm on the 1 chord. When I go to the 4 chord, starting right here from the root. So here's the transition on the A string. Onto the 1 chord again, to the D string. Then on the A chord or the A shape with the 4 chord, it's a 5th. And you can work your way all the way up on this, just practicing those transitions. It's not so much a matter of can you play it fast. It doesn't even matter if you miss notes, honestly. It's not that big of a deal because you're not going to be playing it like this in a song. The idea is that you see where the notes are at. As long as your heart was in the right place, even if your finger doesn't quite make it there, it's okay because that's ultimately, we're trying to get you to be able to see the chords and all the notes in the chords without actually playing them. So no matter what you're doing, I'll have all sorts of cool chord tones to resolve to. Anyway, so that's the exercise. You can put on a chord progression or put on a loop of playing the 1 to the 4. You're probably better off giving yourself a little extra time on each chord if you want to do it that way. Give yourself a chance to settle into it, and then you can just do the exercise and then gradually add in the starter licks and the resolution licks. So, have a good time. Hope that helps.